The strange thing about that morning was not that someone called the police on me. It was that they had absolutely no idea they were standing on property I legally owned. The sharp crunch of tires rolling across fresh gravel pulled my attention away from the last moving box in the back of my pickup truck. Warm Texas sunlight reflected across rows of neatly trimmed lawns while automatic sprinklers clicked back and forth with perfect precision, sending the scent of wet grass drifting through the quiet neighborhood. I had barely lived in my new house for 12 hours when 2 police officers stepped out of a patrol vehicle parked beside my driveway. Behind them, a white golf cart stopped at the edge of the curb, and a woman wearing an immaculate cream-colored blazer climbed out with the confidence of someone who expected every conversation to end in complete agreement. She did not smile. She simply adjusted the folder beneath her arm and walked directly toward me as though she had rehearsed this moment long before I arrived. Curious neighbors quietly appeared on front porches holding coffee mugs while pretending not to watch. The entire street suddenly felt smaller. One of the officers greeted me politely and explained they had received a complaint regarding an individual refusing to comply with mandatory homeowners association requirements. I rested another moving box on the driveway, brushed the dust from my hands, and thanked him for speaking respectfully before answering the only way I honestly could. I am not in your homeowners association. The woman immediately stepped forward. His property is inside Willow Ridge Estates, and everyone here belongs to the association. Her voice carried across the street with practiced certainty. I looked toward the elegant stone entrance standing at the end of the boulevard where polished bronze letters welcomed visitors into the subdivision. Everything about the neighborhood looked expensive. Decorative flower beds lined the sidewalks. Mature oak trees shaded the sidewalks. Brick homes stretched across gently rolling streets that seemed designed for peaceful afternoons rather than arguments. I turned back toward the officers and calmly repeated myself. I am not in your homeowners association. One officer asked whether I had recently purchased the house. I nodded and handed him my closing documents. He carefully reviewed the recorded deed, glanced toward the property address, and returned the paperwork with a professional smile. Your ownership appears to be completely in order, sir. Before I could thank him, the woman interrupted again. She introduced herself as Victoria Ellis, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, and insisted that my refusal to register violated community rules that applied to everyone. Her confidence never wavered. She pointed toward neighboring houses and explained that every homeowner followed the same standards. I listened quietly because nothing she described had anything to do with my recorded property boundary. The officers remained patient while she continued explaining architectural approvals, compliance notices, and association authority. I answered each question respectfully without raising my voice. The breeze carried the smell of fresh mulch across the driveway while cardboard boxes waited beneath the open tailgate of my truck. To everyone watching, it probably appeared that I was simply another stubborn newcomer refusing to cooperate with the neighborhood. What nobody standing there could possibly know was that less than 12 hours earlier I had signed another closing package in a downtown title office. At the time I believed I had purchased an ordinary commercial investment with dependable tenants already in place. I had not yet examined every attachment inside that thick leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat of my truck. If I had opened one particular section before unloading my first moving box, I probably would have recognized a familiar address immediately. Instead, I simply watched the morning unfold, quietly wondering how long it would take before the paperwork caught up with the assumptions surrounding me. Nobody said another word after the officers returned my closing documents. The silence hanging over the driveway felt heavier than the moving boxes stacked behind me. One of the officers politely reminded everyone that property boundary questions were civil matters unless there was evidence of criminal activity. I thanked both officers for their professionalism, carried another box into the garage, and watched them drive away while Victoria Ellis remained standing beside her white golf cart with an expression that suggested the conversation had only been postponed. Before leaving, she informed me that I would soon receive official correspondence from the Homeowners Association and strongly encouraged me to reconsider my position before additional steps became necessary. I wished her a pleasant afternoon, closed the garage door, and returned to unpacking. My name is Nathan Harper, and for more than 20 years I had built my career buying overlooked commercial properties that other investors considered too ordinary to notice. I never chased luxury towers or headline-making developments. Small office buildings, neighborhood retail centers, medical suites, and mixed-use commercial properties had always appealed to me because dependable tenants and careful paperwork created long-term stability. My father spent his entire career as a title examiner, and he taught me something long before I ever purchased my first property. He always said that buildings changed hands every day, but recorded documents remembered everything. That lesson became the foundation of every investment I ever made. A week before moving into Willow Ridge, my attorney introduced me to a retiring investor selling a portfolio of commercial properties scattered throughout the county. The financial records looked solid. The inspection reports were clean. Every tenant appeared established and dependable. We completed due diligence, reviewed environmental reports, confirmed title insurance, and closed the transaction without unexpected complications. Purchasing the nearby house happened almost by coincidence because I wanted a quieter place to live after years of driving between business meetings across Texas. The house sat just beyond the recorded homeowners association boundary according to every survey and title document I reviewed before closing. That detail mattered because I had absolutely no interest in joining neighborhood politics. I respected homeowners associations that operated within their legal authority, but I believed authority ended where recorded property lines ended. By sunset, my living room remained filled with unopened boxes carrying labels from my previous office, family photographs leaned against freshly painted walls, and the familiar leather portfolio from the commercial acquisition rested on the kitchen counter exactly where I had placed it after returning home. I planned to organize those closing documents over the weekend because the transaction involved several different buildings, multiple tenants, insurance certificates, maintenance agreements, and lease assignments that deserved careful filing. At the time, it felt like routine administrative work rather than anything connected to the uncomfortable encounter outside. The following morning proved otherwise. A certified envelope bearing the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association logo waited inside my mailbox before breakfast. The letter informed me that I had failed to comply with mandatory membership requirements and warned that additional enforcement measures could follow if I continued refusing to recognize association authority. I folded the notice neatly, placed it inside the leather portfolio beside the commercial closing documents, and smiled quietly. I did not know it yet, but I had just placed two completely unrelated sets of paperwork into the same folder, and before long they would collide in a way that nobody in Willow Ridge could have possibly expected. The letters did not stop after that first notice. In fact, they seemed to arrive with remarkable consistency, almost as though someone had scheduled them in advance. Every other day another envelope appeared in my mailbox carrying the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association logo across the top. One questioned the appearance of my pickup truck parked in my own driveway. Another suggested I needed architectural approval before replacing a weathered mailbox that had already been there when I purchased the house. A third informed me that my landscaping failed to meet community standards even though the property sat outside the association's recorded boundary according to every survey in my possession. I never threw any of the notices away. Instead, I dated each envelope, photographed every page, and placed them carefully inside the same leather portfolio holding the commercial closing documents. My father used to remind me that unnecessary paperwork often became valuable evidence once enough time had passed. The neighborhood itself remained exactly what I had hoped for when I decided to move there. Children rode bicycles beneath towering oak trees every afternoon. Neighbors walked their dogs along wide sidewalks while sprinklers filled the air with the clean scent of freshly watered grass. Families gathered on front porches as the evening sunlight painted long shadows across quiet streets lined with brick homes and flowering shrubs. It looked like the kind of place where disagreements should disappear as quickly as summer rain. Unfortunately, Victoria Ellis seemed determined to prove otherwise. Nearly every afternoon her white golf cart rolled slowly past my house before stopping just long enough for her to study my property from the street. Sometimes another board member accompanied her with a clipboard. Other times they photographed my driveway, my mailbox, or the landscaping surrounding the front porch before quietly driving away again. None of it bothered me as much as it seemed intended to. Years spent negotiating commercial transactions had taught me that confidence often belonged to the person carrying the strongest documents rather than the loudest opinions. A few neighbors gradually introduced themselves despite the growing rumors. An older couple brought homemade cookies and quietly admitted they had received warning letters over minor issues during previous years. A retired firefighter smiled apologetically while checking his mailbox and said most residents simply found it easier to comply than argue. I thanked each of them for their honesty and assured them I had no interest in creating unnecessary conflict. A few days later, another certified envelope arrived, this time from an attorney representing the association. The letter repeated earlier demands while inviting me to attend an upcoming board meeting to resolve what it described as an ongoing compliance matter. As I finished reading, one small detail unexpectedly caught my attention. The return address belonged to the Willow Ridge Administrative Center located on Brookstone Commerce Parkway. The street name sounded strangely familiar. Instead of dismissing the feeling, I carried the leather portfolio into my home office, opened the commercial closing binder, and began reviewing the tenant directory included with the acquisition package. Page after page listed professional offices, medical practices, insurance agencies, and local businesses occupying the buildings I had recently purchased. Then my eye stopped on one particular entry. Willow Ridge Homeowners Association Administrative Center. Suite 301. Brookstone Commerce Parkway. I read the address again, then compared it to the attorney's letter resting beside the binder. Every number matched perfectly. I leaned back in my chair without saying a word, suddenly realizing that the argument unfolding outside my front door might be connected to a completely different transaction that had quietly closed before I ever unpacked my first moving box. For the next hour I sat alone in my home office while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor and the steady ticking of an old wall clock filled the silence. The leather portfolio remained open beside my laptop, surrounded by neatly organized closing binders, tenant schedules, title reports, insurance certificates, and lease assignments from the commercial acquisition. I read the tenant directory again, then a third time, making certain I had not overlooked a similar street name or transposed a suite number. The address printed on every homeowners association letter matched the address listed inside my commercial property records exactly. Even the suite number was identical. Years of purchasing office buildings had taught me never to celebrate an assumption, no matter how convincing it appeared. Real estate rewarded patience far more often than excitement. I called my attorney, Jennifer Collins, and asked whether she had a few minutes to review one particular section of the acquisition package with me. Her calm voice immediately recognized the address before I even finished explaining why I had called. She asked me to send the tenant roster, the recorded deed, the closing statement, and the executed lease assignment covering that specific building. While waiting for her response, I made fresh coffee and watched the neighborhood through my front window. Children laughed while riding bicycles beneath mature oak trees, sprinklers scattered tiny rainbows across perfectly maintained lawns, and several neighbors waved politely as they walked their dogs past my driveway. It was difficult to believe that such an ordinary evening sat quietly beside a question that could completely change the story unfolding around me. About 40 minutes later, Jennifer called back. She did not sound surprised. She simply confirmed that the office building on Brookstone Commerce Parkway had transferred to my investment company during closing exactly as recorded. She also reminded me that purchasing a commercial building did not give me authority over the homeowners association itself. Their governing documents remained entirely separate from the lease. Then she explained the part that mattered. The association occupied office space as a commercial tenant. The clubhouse, maintenance office, and equipment storage facilities listed within the acquisition package were all improvements located on parcels included in the recorded transaction. Existing leases continued under new ownership unless modified by law or mutual agreement. In other words, my company had quietly become the landlord for the properties the association relied upon every day. I thanked her, then asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since discovering the address. Should I contact Victoria immediately and explain everything? Jennifer answered without hesitation. Absolutely not. Continue documenting every interaction. Allow routine business procedures to unfold naturally. Separate personal disagreements from commercial obligations. Her advice matched the approach I had followed throughout my career, so I agreed without argument. The following morning I instructed my property manager to prepare standard ownership transition packets for every tenant occupying the newly acquired buildings. The Homeowners Association would receive exactly the same welcome letter as every other business. Updated payment instructions, maintenance contacts, emergency numbers, and ownership information. Nothing more. Nothing less. That afternoon another certified envelope appeared on my front porch accusing me of refusing to attend an upcoming board meeting and warning that additional enforcement measures would soon follow. I placed the letter beside the commercial ownership packet that had already been mailed to the association office earlier that morning. Looking at both documents resting side by side, I could not help noticing how differently they described authority. One relied entirely upon assumptions. The other relied upon recorded property records filed at the county courthouse years before either of us ever met. The transition letters reached every tenant before the end of the week, and I treated the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association exactly the same way I treated every other business occupying the commercial properties. My property manager confirmed that each office had received the ownership notice, updated payment instructions, maintenance contact information, and future billing details without incident. There were no special cover letters, no personal comments, and certainly no references to the disagreement unfolding outside my house. Professional boundaries mattered because personal disputes should never influence legitimate business relationships. 2 days later my property manager called again. He explained that the receptionist at the Willow Ridge Administrative Center had contacted him with several routine questions about future rent payments and maintenance requests. According to her, the previous landlord had retired, and they simply wanted to confirm that the ownership transition letter had been sent correctly. I thanked him for the update and instructed him to answer every question exactly as he would for any other tenant. Nothing about the conversation required my direct involvement. That afternoon another envelope waited in my mailbox at home. Victoria had apparently decided that written warnings alone were no longer enough. This latest notice informed me that the board intended to discuss additional compliance measures during its next scheduled meeting and strongly encouraged my attendance. I read the letter carefully before adding it to the growing file inside my leather portfolio. The same folder now contained every association notice, every certified envelope, photographs of each document, my residential closing papers, and the commercial acquisition records that quietly connected both stories together. Looking at everything organized in chronological order, I noticed how differently each side viewed authority. The association believed authority came from community rules. My experience had always taught me that authority began with recorded documents and clearly defined legal boundaries. Neither perspective needed raised voices to become obvious. A few evenings later I drove past the commercial building on Brookstone Commerce Parkway while returning from another property inspection across town. The office complex looked exactly as it had during due diligence before closing. Fresh landscaping surrounded the brick exterior, evening sunlight reflected across clean glass windows, and employees from various businesses carried briefcases toward the parking lot after finishing work. Near the center entrance, a polished directory listed every tenant occupying the building. Willow Ridge Homeowners Association Administrative Center remained clearly displayed beside Suite 301. I sat quietly inside my truck for several moments, watching lights glow through the front windows where board members appeared to be preparing for another meeting. They looked completely unaware that routine ownership paperwork had already changed the legal relationship between tenant and landlord several days earlier. I drove home without stopping because there was nothing further to accomplish that evening. The following morning another certified letter arrived requesting that I appear before the board to explain my continued refusal to recognize association authority. I smiled slightly while reading the final paragraph. The meeting would be held inside the very office building my investment company now legally owned. I folded the invitation neatly, placed it inside my portfolio beside the recorded deed and executed lease assignments, and closed the leather cover with quiet satisfaction. I still had no intention of revealing anything before the appropriate moment. Facts rarely needed dramatic introductions. They simply waited until every assumption had exhausted itself. As the weekend passed beneath clear Texas skies and the neighborhood returned to its usual peaceful routine, I prepared a single slim folder containing only the documents that actually mattered, knowing that before long the conversation everyone expected to control would quietly belong to the paperwork instead. Monday morning began with the familiar aroma of fresh coffee drifting through my office while sunlight reflected across polished conference tables covered with lease files awaiting review. Everything about the day felt ordinary. Maintenance requests from medical tenants, insurance certificates for retail suites, and routine accounting reports filled the first few hours exactly as they had hundreds of times before. Then my property manager knocked gently on my office door carrying a thin folder marked Brookstone Commerce Parkway. He explained that the Willow Ridge Administrative Center had called twice that morning asking for clarification regarding future rent payments because the association treasurer had noticed the ownership transfer notice referenced a company they did not recognize. I thanked him for handling the questions professionally and reminded him that every tenant deserved the same courteous treatment regardless of who occupied the space. He nodded and left without realizing how closely those ordinary business conversations had become connected to the letters waiting in my mailbox at home. Late that afternoon, another certified envelope arrived at my house. Victoria informed me that failure to appear before the Homeowners Association board would result in additional enforcement recommendations and possible legal action. Her confidence remained unchanged from the first morning she arrived with the police officers. I read every page carefully before placing the notice into my leather portfolio beside the recorded deed, lease assignments, ownership transfer documents, and every previous association letter. The growing collection no longer looked like unrelated paperwork. It looked like a timeline patiently documenting two completely different legal relationships moving toward the same destination. The following day, Jennifer called after completing one final review of the acquisition records. She confirmed there were no outstanding ownership disputes, no unresolved title exceptions affecting the commercial parcels, and no pending lease challenges from any tenant. She also reminded me that the association's lease entered its scheduled review period in less than 1 month, meaning every future discussion would proceed through ordinary commercial leasing procedures rather than assumptions. I appreciated her advice because it reinforced exactly what I intended to do. There would be no surprises, no personal retaliation, and no attempt to use ownership as leverage. Facts would remain sufficient. On Wednesday evening, I drove past the office complex after inspecting another property nearby. The parking lot was unusually busy as residents walked toward the administrative office carrying folders, notebooks, and coffee cups for the upcoming board meeting. Through the large front windows, I recognized Victoria standing beside a conference table speaking confidently with several board members while arranging printed agendas into neat stacks. She appeared completely certain that the meeting would finally resolve the disagreement she believed had begun outside my driveway. I remained inside my truck for only a few moments before quietly driving away. There was no reason to interrupt preparations. Everything that needed to be said had already been recorded months earlier at the county courthouse and signed weeks earlier inside a downtown title office. Thursday finally arrived beneath clear Texas skies. Before leaving home, I placed a slim leather portfolio on the passenger seat containing only a handful of carefully organized documents. The recorded deed, the executed lease assignments, the tenant schedule, and the ownership transfer confirmation rested inside crisp protective sleeves. Nothing else seemed necessary. As I locked my front door and walked toward my truck, the neighborhood looked as peaceful as it had the day I first arrived. Sprinklers watered perfectly trimmed lawns, birds filled the oak trees with morning songs, and a light breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the sidewalks. I realized then that by the end of the evening, nothing about the neighborhood itself would actually change. Only the assumptions people carried into that meeting would. The parking lot was already nearly full when I arrived at the Brookstone Commerce Parkway office building just before the scheduled meeting. Warm evening sunlight reflected across the glass entrance while residents carrying notebooks and coffee cups walked toward the administrative office in small groups, exchanging quiet conversations about landscaping, neighborhood projects, and the compliance issue listed on the printed agenda. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. I carried only the slim leather portfolio beneath my arm and entered the lobby without drawing attention to myself. The familiar scent of fresh coffee drifted from the reception area while framed photographs of community events lined the hallway leading toward the conference room. Victoria Ellis stood near the entrance greeting residents with the same confident smile she had worn since the morning she arrived outside my driveway with the police officers. When she noticed me, she paused briefly before welcoming everyone inside. Her expression suggested complete certainty that the evening would finally settle the disagreement on terms she had expected from the beginning. I simply thanked her for inviting me and quietly took a seat near the end of the polished conference table. The room gradually filled until nearly every chair was occupied. Board members arranged thick binders in front of themselves while the association attorney organized legal folders beside a laptop. Residents spoke softly among themselves until Victoria called the meeting to order with a small tap of her wooden gavel. She began by reviewing routine neighborhood business before eventually turning to what she described as an ongoing compliance matter involving a property owner who continued refusing to recognize association authority. Without mentioning my name immediately, she summarized the letters, notices, and previous conversations that had taken place during the past several weeks. Several residents looked toward me with quiet curiosity while others listened without expression. When she finished, Victoria invited me to explain why I believed the association rules did not apply to my property. I stood slowly, thanked the board for allowing me to speak, and answered exactly as I had from the very first day. I respected lawful homeowners associations operating within their recorded authority, but my property remained outside their legally established boundary according to the recorded documents filed with the county. Victoria responded confidently that legal counsel would clarify the matter if necessary. I nodded politely because I completely agreed. That was precisely why I had brought my portfolio. Without making any dramatic announcement, I walked to the attorney and placed four neatly organized documents in front of him. The recorded deed transferring ownership of the commercial parcels. The executed closing statement. The tenant schedule. The lease assignments attached to the acquisition. I returned to my seat without saying another word. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading carefully, page by page, occasionally comparing one document against another while the conference room grew steadily quieter. The only sounds came from the soft turning of paper and the distant hum of the building's air conditioning. Victoria leaned toward him once or twice, quietly asking whether everything appeared routine, but he continued reading before answering. I recognized the expression that slowly appeared across his face because I had seen it many times during commercial negotiations. It was the unmistakable look of someone discovering that the written record told a very different story than the one everyone had been assuming. No one in the room realized it yet, but the silence surrounding those documents had already become far more powerful than every warning letter, every meeting notice, and every confident statement made since I first unpacked a moving box outside my new home. The attorney remained silent for nearly a full minute while everyone else waited for an answer. The conference room had become so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the ceiling lights and the distant sound of a lawn maintenance crew finishing work somewhere outside the building. He carefully compared the recorded deed against the executed lease assignments before turning to the tenant schedule one final time. Victoria leaned forward and quietly asked whether the documents had any connection to the discussion regarding my property. Instead of answering immediately, he placed every page into a neat stack and looked around the room. His voice remained calm, measured, and completely professional. He explained that the residential property dispute and the commercial ownership documents represented two separate legal relationships that should not be confused. My home remained outside the recorded homeowners association boundary according to the county records already reviewed. At the same time, the administrative office where the meeting was taking place, along with the maintenance building, storage facilities, and several related commercial improvements identified in the acquisition package, occupied property that had recently transferred ownership through a properly recorded commercial transaction. Several board members exchanged confused looks before one quietly asked who now owned those commercial parcels. The attorney lowered his reading glasses and answered without hesitation. According to the recorded deed and closing documents before him, the current owner was my investment company. For several long seconds nobody spoke. Victoria looked from the attorney to me, then back toward the documents spread across the conference table as though expecting someone to point out an obvious mistake. Instead, the attorney calmly continued explaining that existing commercial leases generally remained in effect after a lawful transfer of ownership unless modified by contract or applicable law. The Homeowners Association continued operating exactly as before, but it now occupied leased commercial space owned by a different landlord. He emphasized that nothing about the commercial ownership changed the authority of the Homeowners Association within its own recorded boundaries. However, it did establish a separate landlord and tenant relationship regarding the office building and associated commercial property. I thanked him for presenting the documents objectively and explained that I had never intended to surprise anyone. My property manager had already mailed the same ownership transition packet to the Homeowners Association that every other tenant received after the acquisition closed. The routine notices included updated payment instructions, maintenance contacts, and ownership information exactly as required during a normal commercial transfer. I had deliberately kept those business matters separate from the disagreements surrounding my house because they deserved to remain separate. Several residents slowly nodded as the timeline finally began making sense. They realized the letters arriving at my mailbox and the ownership transition occurring at the administrative office had been unfolding simultaneously without either side recognizing how the two stories eventually intersected. Victoria remained unusually quiet before finally asking whether I intended to terminate the association's lease because of everything that had happened during the past several weeks. I answered immediately. Absolutely not. Every tenant deserved fair treatment regardless of personal disagreements. The lease would continue under the exact same professional standards applied to every other business occupying the portfolio. I expected timely communication, respect for contractual obligations, and nothing more. The tension that had filled the conference room since the meeting began slowly disappeared. The documents resting on the polished table had accomplished something no argument ever could. They replaced assumptions with recorded facts, separated emotion from legal reality, and quietly reminded everyone present that true authority is never created by the loudest voice in the room. It is established long before the conversation begins, patiently waiting inside the documents that survive every disagreement. Several weeks passed after that evening, and Willow Ridge slowly returned to becoming the peaceful neighborhood I had hoped it would be when I first carried moving boxes through my front door. Morning sunlight continued spilling across neatly trimmed lawns, sprinklers clicked softly before sunrise, and the familiar scent of fresh-cut grass drifted through open windows while children rode bicycles beneath towering oak trees after school. The streets had not changed, but the conversations had. Neighbors who once watched me from a distance now stopped to introduce themselves properly, often admitting they had simply assumed the Homeowners Association possessed authority over every property in the area because nobody had ever questioned the recorded boundaries. I never criticized anyone for believing what they had been told. Instead, I encouraged them to read their own deeds, surveys, and governing documents before relying on assumptions. A few days after the meeting, Jennifer informed me that the association had acknowledged the ownership transition through the same commercial procedures followed by every other tenant in the portfolio. Monthly rent continued arriving on schedule, maintenance requests moved through the property manager exactly as before, and the lease remained unchanged. The relationship settled into what it should have been from the beginning, professional, predictable, and completely separate from neighborhood disagreements. Victoria eventually requested a private meeting at my office rather than sending another certified letter. She arrived carrying a folder filled with lease records instead of compliance notices. We reviewed ordinary business matters involving building maintenance, insurance certificates, and future communication procedures. Before leaving, she admitted that the disagreement surrounding my house had been handled too aggressively and acknowledged that assumptions had replaced careful verification. I appreciated her honesty because genuine accountability carries far more value than forced apologies. During the next association meeting, the board voted to withdraw every notice previously directed toward my property after completing an independent review of the county records. They also adopted a new policy requiring verification of recorded property boundaries before issuing future enforcement notices involving homes located near subdivision limits. Listening to that decision felt more rewarding than winning any personal argument because it meant the next homeowner would be less likely to experience the same misunderstanding. Life soon settled into an ordinary routine once again. My investment company continued managing the commercial properties, the administrative office remained a dependable tenant, and every interaction moved through established professional channels. Nothing about the commercial lease became personal because business had never been the source of the conflict. One quiet Saturday morning I stood in my driveway holding a cup of coffee while golden sunlight reflected across the neighborhood exactly as it had on the day I first arrived. Victoria drove past in her white golf cart, offered a polite wave, and continued toward the administrative office without stopping. I returned the gesture and watched the neighborhood gradually come to life around me. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson had never been that I owned the commercial property supporting the association's daily operations. The real lesson was that confidence can persuade people for a while, but recorded facts quietly outlast every argument. Deeds, surveys, and properly executed contracts never raise their voices, yet they remain standing long after assumptions have disappeared. As I finished my coffee and listened to birds singing beneath the old oak trees lining the street, I smiled to myself because true authority is never measured by who speaks the loudest. It is measured by the truth patiently waiting inside the documents that everyone eventually has to read.